Now we continue our coverage on reaction to the worsening relations between South Africa and the United States. This follows U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's ex-post saying Rasool was not welcome in the U.S. after he said in a webinar that U.S. President Donald Trump's policies were based on supremacy. President Cyril Ramaphosa has described the decision as regrettable. Now, for more on this story, I'm now joined by the University of Pretoria's Director of the African Center for Study of the United States, Professor Chris Isike. Professor Isike, thank you so much for joining us this evening. There's been undeniable shock to the announcement. However, considering this hostile approach by the Trump administration, not only domestically in the United States, but globally, were you still surprised at this announcement?
Well, I'm glad you said it's not just domestic, it's global, and it's not just to South Africa. It's the penchant for what we call madman theory of foreign policy, towards the rest of the world. Was I surprised? No, given some of the comments that the ambassador has been making, especially in this webinar. It is unacceptable for a diplomats of that stature to make comments about the domestic politics of a host country. However, what surprised me was the fact that they did not follow established protocols, to do this. There would have been a demarche against the ambassador requiring that he explains himself, and then this would have been sorted out the same way we sorted out that of the former ambassador of the U.S. ambassador to South Africa, Ambassador Ruben Brigitte, who made what turned out to be false allegations against South Africa. That was ground for South Africa to also expel him, but we did not do that. So if the relations were cordial, it would have behoven on the U.S. to follow those protocols, but their failure to do so is an indication of how sore the relationships are between South Africa and the U.S. currently.
And talking about, you saying, he should have opted for other channels as well, but let's look at what Ibrahim actually said in that webinar, and I listened to it, and he does begin being pretty fair in saying not all is Trump's fault, that some things are inherited from the Biden administration. He goes on to make the example of the AGOA threat, which he called a continuation. And he splits that talk to say there are things that are a continuation, that are inherited from the Biden administration, but there are things that are discontinuation that are, of course, led by Trump himself. But where does it leave? And I understand that he is an ambassador to the country, and in that host country, there are channels that you should be going through. But where does that leave the idea of diplomatic criticism?
Well, look, I did listen to what he said in the webinar. Like you said, he mentioned the continuities and discontinuities from the past to the present. Everything was okay. He even added that South Africa needs to treat the United States with caution and with respect. He did say that also in that webinar. The problem really is about once he went into the domestic politics terrain of the U.S., talking about the Make America Great Again and the racist ideation that drives that doctrine, as well as implying that the current administration is a supremacist one. Right, so that is where he went into troubling waters, and yes, you can talk about diplomatic criticisms, but also there are channels for doing so. Certainly not in the current moment. What a responsible and more measured approach would have been to keep those comments for now outside of public discussion. Remembering also that Ambassador Rasool is one of the most experienced ambassadors South Africa has, and in terms of even relations with the U.S., he's been ambassador to the U.S. before. So that's where maybe some of us feel a bit disappointed in terms of how he has expressed these particular views, and even if they are correct.
Yeah, and you touched on this now, Prof, but from what he was saying as well, specifically, what would you have taken out?
Well, it's just the whole part about MAGA, it's the whole part about the racist ideation driving it, as well as talking about the supremacist attack on the incumbency in the US and what that means for the rest of the world.
It's just quite interesting as well. Are we entering a terrain where, I mean, the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, had said we will not be bullied by the United States. And it seems that the EU, without even saying it, is also kind of giving the same message, and other countries as well around the world. But are we getting into a space where if we criticize the United States or Donald Trump's administration, there'll be harsh consequences?
That's where we're getting into, unfortunately, and it's not just South Africa, it's everyone else. I think that that's where we are. It's unfortunate, and but I think that because of our current position, like I said in another platform, the relations, the economic relations between South Africa and the US, it's not a one-side street. It's one that also benefits the United States. So if they are prepared to let it all go based on the personal idiosyncrasies of President Trump, so be it for them. But the problem is that we will be worse hit by such a breakdown because of how relatively minor our economy is and the amount of benefits we get from them, through business relations. However, the bottom line is that we must continue to be engaged, to be very matured about how we deal with them, and that's what President Ramaphosa and Ronald Ramola have done so far. We do still have opportunities and arsenals to be able to hit back at the US at some point. One of which is to, vehemently resist the appointment of Joe Pollak as the US ambassador to South Africa, and that would be fair game.
What happens if South Africa doesn't actually reject that as a possibility of Joel Pollak being the next ambassador?
Well, look, well, if they don't reject it, so be it. But he's not less tactful. I mean, he's not more tactful than Ibrahim Rasool. In fact, he's been engaged in comments that disparage and disrespect the president of South Africa, and even what you may call interference in the domestic politics of South Africa. If you look at what he said about the U.S. consulates being closed down if the local council changes the name of the street from Santon Drive to Leila Khaled Drive, as the council wanted to do. That's an interference, and that's unnecessary showmanship from someone who's aspiring to be ambassador in South Africa. If South Africa doesn't turn him down, well, it is probably will be one of the compromises the country will make in order to try and fix the relations. But it appears to me that respecting Trump is good, but respecting him does not mean kowtow to him or making the country look like we're not a sovereign state. And we do have some leverage that we can exert. We just need to make sure that we do so at the right time and in line with South Africa's strategic interests.
Yeah, and that leverage, it will be interesting to see how it is then utilized. In terms of also just this South Africa's diplomatic and measured response to all of this as well, from the president to the Minister of International Relations as well, and also to a large extent, Ibrahim Rasool, the former ambassador to the US, because he did also close off there by saying that people shouldn't panic, but he also warned that while parties like the Democratic Alliance have said, the president needs to fast track an envoy and send to Washington to deal with this, in that webinar, Ibrahim Rasool said, look, unfortunately, in so many words, like the door's not open. There's no one behind those doors to speak to. Basically, this is not fertile ground for us to be able to have a mature and measured and diplomatic conversation with Washington at this point. So we need to hang 10. So which approach do we take? What the DA is recommending here to say to the president, look, send an envoy, fast track that, or what Ibrahim Rasool was saying in that webinar to say, let's hold back. He also used that example of rugby, holding back your best players here.
Well, I don't think he's correct. He's actually correct that the doors are locked. The doors seem to be opening, although at a lower level, like Rasool said, for non-state actors like the AfriForum. And we shouldn't be surprised if tomorrow the US also targets particular ANC members, as the AfriForum has called, and deny them access to South Africa, to America, or even find ways to sanction them, right? So the U.S. administration is clearly listening to non-state actors and deliberately ignoring the South African state actors. And this is a deliberate stance they are taking. So that's why, in my view, South Africa should not appoint an ambassador to the U.S. currently. They should not rush to send any GNU, party to the US, because they will meet closed doors. The right people who should be speaking to them at that state-to-state level, most of them have not been appointed, and Marco Rubio has a very disrespectful stance towards South Africa right now. So I would rather cool off and watch to see what they do. If they appoint Polak, push back on it, and then thereafter, if there's a compromise and South Africa will begin to engage, it depends on the US. The US does have something to lose as well, apart from the economic value. South Africa is a very important country as a gateway country to Africa for the US, as well as an ally that they should have in the BRICS. And the way the world is going currently, we may have a new order in place in which countries like South Africa would play a very important role in terms of non-entrepreneurship. So it will be to the U.S. Own disadvantage if it isolates itself from everyone or pushes its traditional allies to coalesce around its traditional adversaries. And that's what we are beginning to see happen in various sectors of the world.
And Prof, briefly, just in closing, how do you think the handover of the G20 presidency will be managed when you have these two countries who are at loggerheads, with one being pretty hostile toward the other one and the other one taking a more passive approach? How does that handover then happen?
Well, this is only going to be in November. So between now and November, a lot will happen. And depending on what happens between now and then, South Africa would face that challenge very stoically and not necessarily pander to the US without good reason. It is up to the US to decide whether they want to do that takeover or not. It's up to them, really,
Well, Professor Isike, we'll wait and see to see what happens all the way in November already. Thank you so much for your insights and joining us this evening.